He was a billionaire, one of the most powerful men in Chicago, a man who owned buildings that touched the clouds, who signed contracts that moved markets, who sat at tables where decisions were made that ordinary people would never even hear about. And then one day, he lost his mind. Or at least, that is what everyone believed. His board of directors watched him hold a pen upside down in a meeting room where he once commanded billions, and they shook their heads and quietly began dividing his empire among themselves. His fiancée, the breathtaking, beloved Victoria Lane Hartwell, held his hand in front of cameras, cried for magazine covers, and called it love. Then she packed her wardrobe into the guest suite, stopped eating dinner with him, and began making phone calls. She ended the moment anyone walked into the room. His most trusted colleagues, his closest allies, the men and women who had smiled at his table and drunk his champagne and called him brother. They filed legal motions, triggered competency clauses, and began signing documents with his name attached to transactions he never authorized. One by one, every single person who had claimed to love him, need him and stand by him left. Every single one. Except her. A poor maid from a small town in Ohio who had no money, no connections, no power, and absolutely no reason, by the world's calculation, to stay. She was not his girlfriend. She was not his family. She was not even his friend, not in any way the world would recognize. She was the woman who brought his meals when the other staff left trays outside his door, who read him financial news when everyone else spoke to him in slow, oversimplified sentences, who sat with him in the dark without flinching, without pitying, without leaving. She stayed. And what this broken, silent, supposedly shattered billionaire did for her in return, nobody saw coming. Not his fiancée, not his board, not his enemies, not even her. But before we get to the moment that will make your jaw drop, before we get to the act that changed everything, we need to ask the question sitting right at the center of this story. Why would one of the most powerful billionaires in the country pretend to lose his mind? And what was he really watching for while everyone thought he was broken? What kind of woman stays beside a man the whole world has written off? And what is the secret she carried into his household from the very first day that nobody, not even Marcus Stone himself, knew about? And when the truth finally detonates, when the billionaire rises and every betrayer is exposed, what is the one unexpected act he does for the woman who never gave up on him that leaves everyone, including her, completely speechless? Stay right here, because this story does not just have a twist, it has a reckoning. The city of Chicago did not sleep. It shifted. It breathed and rearranged itself in the hours between midnight and dawn like a restless machine that had forgotten the purpose of stillness, its towers of glass and reinforced steel catching the flat October light and fracturing it into cold, indifferent brilliance across the surface of Lake Michigan. From the 54th floor of Stone Capitol Tower, the tallest privately owned commercial floor in the entire state of Illinois, a distinction that appeared in 3 separate architectural journals and that Harold Stone had pursued with the specific, ungentle intensity of a man who believed that height was not vanity but vocabulary. The city did not look like a place where ordinary people lived and loved and made mistakes that followed them for decades. It looked like a system, a living argument for precision, a machine that rewarded the calculated and dismantled the sentimental, and had been doing both, without apology or ceremony, for well over a century. Marcus Elliott Stone stood at the window with a glass of water in his right hand and the silence of the room at his back, and he watched Chicago the way a man watches something he owns but has never fully trusted. He was 34 years old. 6 feet 1 inch in the flat-soled dress shoes he preferred because he had no interest in borrowed height. He had dark hair cut close without vanity, a jaw that photographers had described in 4 separate publications as architectural, and eyes that were, in raw terms, an unremarkable shade of brown. What was not unremarkable about them was their quality of attention. When Marcus Stone looked at you, the experience was specific and difficult to articulate afterward. It was the sensation of being the only object in a very large and otherwise empty room. Some people found it affirming. Most found it deeply destabilizing. Everyone, without exception, remembered it long after the conversation had ended and the room had emptied and the night had moved on. He had inherited Stone capital at 28 on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 6 years ago, in the specific and brutal way that inheritances sometimes arrive, not through paperwork and anticipation, but through catastrophe and no warning at all. Harold Stone, 61 years old, built like a former athlete who had traded the field for the boardroom without entirely abandoning the combativeness of either, had been mid-sentence in Conference Room A, a point about Southeast Asian liquidity ratios, a topic he could discuss with the fluency of a man who had spent 30 years making Southeast Asian liquidity ratios personally profitable, when his body simply stopped cooperating. He pitched forward. His forehead met the mahogany table with a sound that the 4 people in the room would spend years trying to forget. The cardiac arrest was complete and efficient and merciless in the way that the body's betrayals often are, and by the time the paramedics arrived at minute 14, Harold Stone was gone. Marcus had been sitting 3 chairs away. He had watched his father fall. He had been the first person on his feet, the first person to call emergency services, the first person kneeling on the floor beside a man who had taught him, through a combination of deliberate instruction and brutal example, everything Marcus knew about how power worked and what it cost, and why it was worth the price. He stayed on that floor beside his father for the 11 minutes it took the paramedics to arrive, and he did not pray because Harold had raised him to believe that prayer was what people did when they had run out of preparation, and Harold had never run out of preparation in his life. He did not grieve in any way that interrupted the work. People who did not know Marcus Stone interpreted this as coldness. People who understood him knew it was the opposite. It was the most profound form of respect he knew how to offer, which was to protect what Harold had built with the same ferocity Harold had built it with. He arranged the funeral. He thanked the board with the precise warmth the moment required. He went home to the penthouse Harold had designed at the top of the residential tower adjacent to Stone Capital, a penthouse that occupied 6,000 square feet of the Chicago skyline, and had been furnished not with the ostentatious excess that new money favored but with the specific, curated restraint of a man who understood that taste was power's quieter cousin. And he sat in the leather chair by the east window from 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. and he thought. Not prayed, not wept, thought. What passed through his mind during those 5 hours remained the most private thing Marcus Stone possessed, more guarded than his finances, more protected than the succession clauses buried in Stone Capital's original founding charter, clauses that had been written by Harold Stone 20 years ago in a moment of trust so complete that it had never occurred to Harold that trust, like any other asset, could be weaponized by the right person at the right moment. Those clauses existed. Marcus knew they existed. What Marcus did not know, sitting in that chair in the dark while Chicago hummed 43 floors below him, was that someone else knew about them too, had known for years, and had been building a plan around them with the patience and precision of a man who understood that the best time to move against a fortress was not when it was defended, but when it was grieving. In the 3 years after Harold's death, Marcus tripled Stone Capital's net worth. He crushed 4 hostile takeover attempts with a strategic efficiency that became the subject of a Harvard Business School case study. He earned the name the Iron Claws in financial media because of his relationship with commitment. When Marcus Stone signed something, it held. Not because of legal infrastructure, though his legal team was among the most formidable in the Midwest, but because Marcus was constitutionally, fundamentally, almost pathologically incapable of letting a promise break. It was the one inheritance from Harold that he had never examined, never questioned, and never once considered returning. His penthouse was the kind of space that made architects quietly emotional. The floors were poured concrete, sealed and polished to a surface that reflected the city light like still water. The walls held original works, not purchased for investment, though they had appreciated considerably, but chosen because Harold Stone had believed that a man who surrounded himself with ugliness was making a statement about what he thought he deserved. A Basquiat in the study. A Kara Walker in the hallway that led to the master suite. A small, almost modest Richard Serra drawing in the kitchen that had cost more than most people's homes. The kitchen itself was designed by a James Beard, award-winning culinary consultant, and equipped with appliances that required separate manuals. The master suite looked east, toward the lake, and the windows ran floor to ceiling for 22 feet, which meant that on clear mornings the entirety of Lake Michigan presented itself to Marcus Stone like a daily reminder of scale. He was engaged to Victoria Lane Hartwell, and their engagement was the kind of social architecture that made other couples' announcements feel like footnotes. Victoria was 31 years old, the daughter of Senator Gerald Hartwell of Illinois, a man who had held his Senate seat for 16 years through a combination of genuine political talent, strategic alliance building, and a relationship with donor networks that was so finely tuned it functioned less like fundraising and more like maintenance. Victoria had been raised in the specific, weaponizable grace of political old money, Georgetown undergraduate, London School of Economics for her master's, 3 years at a boutique investment consultancy in New York, before returning to Chicago to, as she told interviewers with the perfectly calibrated smile of a woman who had been practicing perfectly calibrated smiles since age 7, come home. She was luminously beautiful in a way that translated flawlessly across every medium, from telephoto lenses to intimate dinner parties to television appearances, which she made with a frequency and composure that suggested she had been born in front of a camera and simply never left. She loved Marcus. This was the part of the story that would later become the most agonizing complication, the fact that Victoria Lane Hartwell genuinely, authentically loved Marcus Stone. She loved his intelligence. She loved his stillness. She loved the way he occupied a room, and she loved what he represented, what his name carried, what his signature could open and close and command. For a long time, for most of their 3-year relationship, those two categories of love, the personal and the strategic, had coexisted without friction, because they were pointed in the same direction. It was only when events forced them apart, only when loving Marcus the man and leveraging Marcus the asset became mutually exclusive choices, that the audience would discover which love in Victoria was stronger, and the discovery would be devastating. Because until that moment, she had been so convincing, so genuinely, heartbreakingly convincing, that even the people closest to her had believed she was simply a woman in love. On the morning this story truly begins, a morning in the middle of October with flat silver light and a wind off the lake that carried the first real suggestion of winter, Marcus was in his study reviewing an acquisition brief when the door opened without a knock. Not boldly, not intrusively, simply opened, the way doors open when someone is lost and not yet aware that being lost matters. She stood in the doorway with a cleaning caddy in one hand and a folded staff map in the other, and she looked at Marcus Stone without flinching, without dissolving into apology, without performing the elaborate deference that the architecture of wealth typically extracted from people who accidentally wandered into its private spaces. She was 27. Brown eyes that were unremarkable until they were on you, at which point they became the most attentive eyes in any room because of what they held, not calculation, not performance, but a quality of genuine, unhurried presence that was rarer than beauty and considerably more durable. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I'll find my way out." And she turned and left. No 17 apologies, no visible collapse of confidence. Just a calm, clean exit that somehow, in its very simplicity, occupied the room longer than she did. Marcus stood at the window with his water glass for a long moment after the door closed. Something had moved through him during those 15 seconds. something he could not name and did not try to, because Marcus Stone had learned from Harold that the things you cannot name are frequently the most important things, and the correct response to them is not analysis but patience. So he filed it, quietly and without ceremony, in whatever part of him handled the things that mattered before he understood why they mattered. At 6 p.m., Mrs. Good's staff intake sheet arrived on his desk. He read it at his standing desk with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. The new hire's entry was third from the top. Clara June Wade, age 27, Millfield, Ohio. He read the name once, set the sheet down, picked up his phone and called Victoria about the seating arrangement for the engagement gala. But the name had landed somewhere in him, quiet and precise and patient, like a key placed carefully on a table, not yet turned, not yet needed. But there. Millfield, Ohio was the kind of town that didn't make maps apologize for leaving it out. It sat in the southwestern corner of the state with the particular, undefended modesty of a place that had never needed to announce itself because it had never expected anyone to come looking. One main road, a diner called Patsy's that had been serving the same breakfast menu since 1987, a Dollar General that doubled as the social hub on Friday evenings, a water tower with the town's name painted on it in letters that had been fading since the early 2000s and that nobody had repainted, not because no one cared, but because in Millfield certain kinds of fading were simply accepted as part of the landscape. The way people accepted the sound of the freight train that cut through at 2 a.m. every night, present, reliable, and completely beyond anyone's control. Clara June Wade had grown up in a white clapboard house on Sycamore Street, third house from the corner, the one with the front porch that leaned slightly to the left, because her father had built it himself on a weekend in 2003, and had been meaning to fix the foundation ever since. James Wade was a construction foreman, a broad-shouldered, methodical man who approached every problem in his life with the same combination of patience and incremental precision that he applied to his work sites, which was why the people who worked for him loved him, and why the porch never got fully fixed, because James was a man who was always solving the problem in front of him, and the porch, leaning gently but not dangerously to the left, was never quite the most urgent thing. He had taught Clara three things above everything else. The first, that your word was the only currency that couldn't be inflated or devalued. The second, that dignity was not given to you by circumstance, you carried it yourself or you didn't have it. And the third, delivered across the kitchen table when Clara was 15 and had come home furious about an injustice at school that the principal had dismissed without investigation. He had waited until she finished, folded his hands on the table and said, "Always read what's buried, Clara. Anybody can see what's on top. The truth hides in the fine print. Find it there." She had written it in the back cover of every journal she'd kept since. James Wade died 4 years ago. He was 51 years old. The scaffolding on a commercial construction site in downtown Chicago, a Stone Capital Properties development project on the North Shore, a mixed-use residential tower that had broken ground in March and was 8 weeks behind schedule, which meant the pressure from above to accelerate had been intense and continuous, had not been properly secured. The site supervisor's inspection log showed 3 consecutive daily checks marked compliant for the scaffolding in question. Those checks were later found to have been falsified. James Wade was on the 3rd level when the structure separated from the building face. He fell 31 feet. He survived the fall by 4 hours, long enough for Clara to drive from Columbus, where she was working at the time, to the hospital in Chicago where he had been airlifted. Long enough for her to sit beside his bed and hold his hand while the machines worked, and the doctors used words that were technically informative and humanly useless. Long enough for him to open his eyes once, look at her, and say, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had spent his whole life being precisely who he was. "You know what to do, baby girl." He closed his eyes at 11:47 p.m. The case was settled out of court 14 months later. Stone Capital's legal team was thorough and efficient and surgically compassionate in the way that institutional legal teams are when they need to make a problem disappear, without generating the kind of documentation that becomes inconvenient in future litigation. Clara received a settlement. She cashed the check. She moved her mother, Dorothy Wade, who had been diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease 6 months after James died, as though the body, having lost the person it had loved longest, decided to begin its own quiet withdrawal into a smaller house with a manageable mortgage. She enrolled her brother Tommy, 19, in community college on a scholarship that required continuous financial maintenance. And she began looking for work that paid enough to hold all of it together, without breaking herself in the process. She had 3 job offers when she found the Stone Capital household listing: an administrative coordinator position at a healthcare nonprofit in Columbus, a junior events coordinator role at a hotel group in Cincinnati, and a live-in maid position at the private penthouse residence of Marcus Elliott Stone, Chicago, Illinois, paying 3 times the market rate, including accommodation, full medical subsidy for dependents as specified in a clause buried. And this was the word that stopped her, the word her father had underlined in her memory like a verse underlined in a Bible, buried in page 7 of the employment contract, subsection 4C, under the heading Supplementary Staff Benefits. She found it on a Thursday evening at her kitchen table in Columbus, with a cup of cold coffee and her father's voice in her ear. Always read what's buried. She read subsection 4C 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long moment with her hands flat on the table. The medical subsidy covered dialysis costs. Her mother's dialysis costs were the number she woke up thinking about every morning. Had been for 2 years. She applied the next morning. She did not tell anyone in her application or her interview or her first week on the property that her father had been James Wade, that James Wade had died on a Stone Capital scaffolding, that the check which had kept her family from complete financial collapse had originated from the same corporate address as her new employer's letterhead. She did not lie. She simply did not volunteer. There is a distinction, though it is a narrow one, and Clara Wade understood its geography precisely. On her first day, reporting to Mrs. Patricia Good in the staff kitchen at 7 a.m., she received her uniform dove gray, formal, with a small embroidered SC on the breast pocket that stood for Stone Capital and that Clara looked at for exactly 1 second before tucking her name badge over it, and her assignment sheet. 3rd floor, East Wing, primary residence rooms, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. She was given a staff map. She studied it. She thought she understood it. She did not understand it. Which was how, at 8:15 a.m. on her first day, she opened the wrong door on the wrong floor and found herself standing in the private study of Marcus Elliott Stone, the man whose company name was embroidered on her breast pocket, the man whose lawyers had settled her father's death for a number that fit in a single check, the man who did not yet know that the woman standing in his doorway with a cleaning caddy and a folded map had signed her name into his household with complete knowledge of who he was, and had come, not for revenge, not for exposure, but for the buried thing in subsection 4C that would keep her mother alive. She looked at him without flinching. She said, "I'm sorry, sir, I'll find my way out," and she left. What she did not see, could not have seen, because she had already turned and the distance was too great and the moment too brief, was the way Marcus Stone's eyes followed her out of the room, not with suspicion, not with recognition in any useful sense, but with that involuntary, inexplicable attention that a compass gives to north, the kind of attention that does not ask permission and does not explain itself, and is not, in any way, optional. The other staff members had noticed Clara within her first week, in the way a household notices any new addition, with the careful, sideways observation of people whose domestic ecosystem was about to be rearranged. Denise Traylor, the senior maid, 34 and aggressively friendly in the particular way that conceals competitive surveillance, had introduced herself on day one with a smile and a coffee, and a 14-minute monologue about the household hierarchy that was, Clara noted, almost entirely about Victoria Lane Hartwell, and almost entirely complimentary, which told Clara something about Denise's primary allegiance that no formal org chart could have communicated more clearly. Kevin Shaw, Marcus's personal assistant, had nodded at Clara in the corridor on day 3 with the distracted efficiency of a man who processed information in order of urgency, and had not yet determined where a new maid ranked. He was 30, wire-thin, chronically caffeinated, and operated with the particular nervous precision of someone who had calibrated their entire professional identity around the rhythms and expectations of one very specific person. He had been with Marcus for 4 years. He knew Marcus's schedule better than Marcus did. He knew which silences meant thinking and which meant displeasure, and which meant the particular variety of exhaustion that Marcus would never name, but that Kevin had learned to manage with the same quiet professionalism he applied to everything else. He was, Clara would observe over the following weeks, genuinely devoted, which made what he would eventually do all the more instructive about the limits of devotion, when it is not anchored in something deeper than professional loyalty. Mrs. Patricia Good ran the household with the precision of a woman who had been doing so for 22 years and had long since stopped distinguishing between her professional identity and her personal one. She was 58, silver-haired, straight-backed, and possessed of a manner so correct and contained that it functioned as its own kind of authority. She had served Harold Stone before Marcus. She knew the penthouse the way people know their own bodies, every system, every rhythm, every seasonal variation. She took an immediate and visible dislike to Clara, not cruel in any demonstrable way, but cold in the specific and unmistakable manner of a woman who had decided, before the evidence was in, that this particular new staff member was a problem. Clara noted it, filed it, did not react to it. She had grown up the daughter of a construction foreman in a small Ohio town. She knew what it felt like to be assessed and found wanting before she'd opened her mouth, and she had long since learned that the correct response was not defense but performance, not of deference, but of competence so consistent and unassailable that even the coldest prejudgment eventually ran out of material to work with. What Clara could not know, what none of the staff could know, was why Patricia's dislike was so immediate and so specific. What Patricia carried in the private architecture of her 22-year loyalty to the Stone family. What she knew about the scaffolding report. What she had been asked to do, years ago, by a man she trusted completely, and what it had cost her, and why that cost, rather than making her protective of people like Clara, had instead made her dangerous to them. That truth was coming. It was not yet time. Victoria Lane Hartwell arrived at the penthouse on Clara's 4th day, sweeping in from a charity board meeting in a cream wool coat that cost more than Clara's monthly rent in Columbus, trailed by Amber Cole, her personal assistant, 26, sharp-featured, watchful in the way of someone who is always calculating the distance between their current position and the position they actually want. Victoria moved through the penthouse with the proprietary ease of a woman who had already decided that this space was hers, that the merger was already complete in every way that mattered, that the paperwork of the actual wedding was administrative formality. She greeted the staff with the warm, inclusive smile of a woman who had been raised to understand that the people who clean your house see everything and remember everything, and should therefore always be made to feel, at least on the surface, that they are valued. When she reached Clara, she paused, looked at her for a moment that lasted precisely 1 beat too long. "You're the new girl," she said. "Not a question, a classification." "Clara Wade, ma'am," Clara said. "I started Monday." Victoria's smile did not change. "Wonderful," she said and moved on. But Amber Cole, trailing 2 steps behind, looked back at Clara once, and the look was not the look of an assistant cataloging a new staff member. It was the look of someone taking a measurement. In his study that evening, Marcus Stone sat at his desk after midnight reviewing a confidential investigator's report. Not about Victoria, not yet, but about a business rival's offshore holding structure, a routine competitive intelligence brief. When his phone lit up with a text from Victoria, "Thinking of you. Can't wait for the gala. You're going to love the seating plan I've arranged. Red heart." He typed back, "Can't wait," set his phone face down, returned to the report. 3 pages in, the investigator had attached a secondary document, a cross-reference that had surfaced incidentally during research, a private communication between 2 parties not related to the original subject of investigation. Marcus almost skipped it. Standard practice was to log and ignore cross-reference material that fell outside the brief's parameters. He almost skipped it. He didn't. He read the first paragraph. Then he went back and read it again. Then he set the document down on his desk very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started doing something involuntary that you do not want to acknowledge. He sat in the silence of the penthouse for a long time. Outside, Chicago moved through its night. The lake was invisible in the darkness. Its presence felt rather than seen, enormous and indifferent and patient. Marcus picked up the document again and read it to the end. His left hand, resting on the desk, did not tremble. Not yet. That performance was weeks away, and when it came, every tremor would be chosen, every vacancy constructed, every fragmented sentence deliberate. But in this moment, in the privacy of his father's study at 1 in the morning with a document on the desk that had just rewritten the story of the last 3 years of his life, Marcus Stone sat completely still and began to plan. The engagement gala was held on the 42nd floor of the Langham Hotel, a room that the hotel's events director described in promotional materials as Chicago's most prestigious private event space. And that justified the description with 17-foot ceilings, a wall of windows facing Lake Michigan, and the kind of ambient lighting that made everyone inside it look as though they had been professionally lit for a film they hadn't auditioned for. 400 guests. 7-piece jazz ensemble. A champagne pyramid that had been assembled by a specialist over 3 hours, and that stood at the center of the room like a monument to the specific variety of excess that manages, through sheer scale, to become taste. Marcus arrived at 7 in a black tuxedo that his tailor had spent 4 fittings perfecting, and that he had put on in 8 minutes without consulting a mirror. He stood at the room's edge for 3 minutes before Victoria found him, studying the assembled guests with the expression of a man reading a balance sheet, not admiring the numbers, simply understanding them. He could identify from where he stood 4 sitting politicians, 2 federal judges, the CEO of the largest commercial bank in the Midwest, and at least 3 men whose professional relationship with Senator Gerald Hartwell was a matter of public record, and whose presence here tonight was therefore, in retrospect. In the retrospect Marcus would apply to this evening weeks later from a hospital bed, with a document burning a hole in his memory. Less a celebration of an engagement and more an attendance at a positioning event. They had come to be seen at the right table, to be documented in the right photographs, to register their presence in the social record of an alliance that, from certain strategic vantage points, looked less like a love story and more like a merger. He had not yet read the document when he arrived that evening. That came later, but certain things Marcus would realize much later he had already known without knowing them. The way a body knows it is ill before the fever arrives, before the diagnosis, before the language that makes the knowledge official. He had known something was off-center. He simply had not looked directly at it. Victoria appeared at his arm in a white backless gown that made the room rearrange its attention the moment she entered. She was radiant in the specific way of someone who has prepared for a long time to appear unprepared. Her hair was up, simple, a choice that had taken 40 minutes to achieve. Her jewelry was understated. Harold Stone's vintage diamond earrings, which Marcus had given her 6 months into their relationship, a gesture he had made because they had reminded him of her in a jewelry case, and that she had accepted with a warmth so genuine he had not questioned it for a single moment. "You look beautiful," he said, and he meant it, which was the part that made everything harder. "You look like you're calculating something," she said, which was also true, and which she said with a smile that suggested she found this charming rather than concerning. Senator Gerald Hartwell materialized at Marcus's left shoulder with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had been working rooms for 16 years and had long since stopped experiencing them as spaces to navigate and started experiencing them as environments to command. He was 63, broad in the way of a former college athlete who had softened at the edges without losing the underlying architecture of physical authority. His handshake was the handshake of a man who understood that grip communicated information. "Marcus," he said with the warmth of a man greeting a son-in-law, which was, Marcus would later understand precisely what it was, not affection, category assignment. "You know how proud Harold would be tonight. He always said you'd build something worth celebrating." "He did," Marcus said, and the smile he produced was exactly the right size. The gala moved through its choreography, speeches, toasts, the champagne pyramid distributed by staff in white gloves, photographers whose flashes punctuated the evening like a slow, glittering percussion. Marcus moved through it all with the practiced ease of a man who had been attending events of this scale since his father first brought him to a Stone Capital investor dinner at age 14 and told him afterward, "The party isn't the event, Marcus. The party is where the real meetings happen. Watch who talks to whom for longer than they need to. That's where the business is." Clara was there, not as a guest, as a staff member, assigned to the event's catering crew as additional support, moving through the room with a tray of champagne flutes. She wore the standard service uniform, moved efficiently and without drawing attention. She had been doing this kind of work for 2 years before the Stone household position, events catering, weekend hospitality shifts, anything that paid on top of her regular income, because her mother's medical costs were a number that did not respond to regular income alone. Marcus saw her once across the room, a 3-second window between conversations, a gap in the crowd, and there she was tray-level, posture straight, moving with the unhurried competence he had registered in his doorway on her first day. Their eyes met for a moment so brief that neither of them could have said with certainty, afterward, whether it had happened or whether they had simply been looking in the same direction at the same moment, and the eye contact had been incidental. She looked away first, and the crowd closed between them, and Marcus turned back to a conversation about commercial zoning that he managed to conduct with apparent total engagement for 11 minutes, while a separate part of his mind filed the moment in the same place it had filed her name. He did not know, watching her move through the crowd, that she was the daughter of James Wade. He did not know that the settlement his legal team had processed 14 months ago had been paid to the woman currently carrying a champagne tray through his engagement party. He did not know this, and when he eventually discovered it, weeks later, from a source he had not expected, in a context that made the information land with the weight of something load-bearing, the discovery would alter the geometry of everything that followed in ways that neither of them had designed, and both of them would have to navigate without a map. The evening ended. Guests departed. Victoria kissed Marcus at the door of the penthouse with the particular warmth of someone who is genuinely happy and not performing happiness, which, in the calculus of everything that followed, made the document worse, made the plan behind it worse, because it confirmed what Marcus had half hoped was not true, that the person he loved had somehow remained genuinely loving while simultaneously being part of something that would have destroyed him. He sat at his desk at 1 a.m. 3 days later. He would receive the document. He didn't know that yet. He poured 2 fingers of scotch, looked at the Basquiat on the study wall, a painting his father had bought in 1994, and that Harold had once described as a map of how power actually moves, not how people pretend it does. and sat in the silence of the penthouse while the city went about its endless, unsleeping business below. The document arrived in his email at 11:47 p.m. on the third day after the gala, forwarded from his investigator with a subject line that read only, "Cross-reference, non-responsive to original brief, flagging per protocol." Marcus opened it at his desk, read the first paragraph, went back and read it again. It was a private communication between Senator Gerald Hartwell and Victoria Lane Hartwell, dated 26 months ago, 5 months before Marcus and Victoria had begun dating, before the introduction at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs dinner that both of them had described in multiple interviews as accidental, as fate, as one of those encounters that neither person had seen coming. The document was 4 pages long. It was written in the specific language of a man who had been in politics long enough to say exactly what he meant, while maintaining just enough deniability to survive if the wrong person read it. But Marcus had spent 6 years reading contracts that were written in exactly this kind of strategic ambiguity, and he understood every word of it with the cold, total clarity of a man who had been building contingencies his entire professional life, and now found himself needing one. The succession clause in Harold Stone's original company charter, named specifically, Gerald Hartwell named as trustee, the mechanism by which incapacitation or death before an heir would redirect controlling shares, the estimated timeline, the strategy for the competency review, the name of the judge with whom the senator had an existing relationship. The phrase, and this was the line Marcus read 4 times slowly, with a stillness that was not calm, but was the thing that existed on the other side of calm, the place a person goes when the emotion is too large for the body to process in real time. The phrase, "The introduction can be arranged for early spring. She should move quickly. 3 years should be sufficient." 3 years should be sufficient. Their relationship was 2 years and 9 months old. Marcus set the document down. He sat in the silence of his father's penthouse for a very long time. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did. The lake was invisible and immense. The Basquiat looked down from the wall with its fractured electric geometry, its map of how power actually moved. Then Marcus Stone opened his desk drawer, took out a legal pad, and began, in the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who had learned from his father that the most dangerous weapon available to a patient person was time, to write down everything he would need. He would not confront them. He would not call a lawyer in the morning. He would not expose them before he knew the full width of the conspiracy. Who else had been positioned? Who else had been recruited? Who else was waiting in the architecture of his trust for the right moment to move? He would do what Harold Stone had told him, at age 14, watching a man at an investor dinner lean too close to someone else's wife while pretending to discuss mutual funds. Let them think they're winning, Marcus. The most expensive mistake a predator makes is believing the prey doesn't know it's being hunted. He closed the legal pad. He picked up his phone, sent Victoria a good-night text. She replied with 3 hearts and a sleepy emoji. He set the phone down face first on the desk, and in the silence, in the dark, in the penthouse that still carried his father's DNA in its architecture, and its art and its unspoken expectations, Marcus Stone made a decision that would cost him more than he could calculate in that moment and return to him more than he had the imagination to predict. He would let them win. For now. It happened on a Wednesday morning, which was, in retrospect, the most Marcus Stone kind of timing imaginable. Not a dramatic Friday or a symbolically loaded Monday, but a Wednesday, midweek, mid-morning, during what should have been a routine call with his Singapore office about a currency hedge position. He was standing at his desk, not sitting, because he rarely sat during phone calls, a habit from Harold, who believed that the body's posture communicated to the brain what mode it was in, and Marcus had never bothered to examine whether this was scientifically valid because it had always worked. He was mid-sentence when the right side of his vision went white. Not dark, white, which was worse somehow. A total absence of visual information rather than a presence of darkness, as though the world had simply decided, in that hemisphere of his sight, to stop providing data. His right hand, holding a pen over his notepad, stopped responding to what his brain was telling it. He heard the voice on the phone, his Singapore director, David Chen, continuing to speak about the currency hedge with the focused fluency of a man who did not know that on the other end of the line, the person he was speaking to had just stopped being entirely operational. And Marcus understood, with the specific, horrible clarity of a man whose intelligence continued to function while his body began to betray it, exactly what was happening. He managed to say, "David, I need to call you back," and the sentence came out intact, which would later strike him as both a mercy and a diagnostic data point. Then he set the phone down on his desk, very carefully, and called Kevin Shaw's extension. "Kevin," he said, "call Dr. Chu, tell him I need him here now." A pause. "Don't call Victoria yet." Another pause, and then, because Marcus Stone was not in the habit of leaving instructions ambiguous, "Don't call anyone else." The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. Kevin, who had the presence of mind in a crisis that came from 4 years of managing crises on a scale that would have dismantled a lesser assistant, had Dr. Raymond Chu on the phone within 3 minutes and the paramedics en route within 5. He rode in the ambulance with Marcus, sitting across from him in the vehicle's narrow corridor with his hands clasped, and his face doing something complicated that he was trying very hard not to show, because Kevin Shaw understood that Marcus Stone did not want to be panicked over, and that the most useful thing he could do in this vehicle was remain calm and functional. Marcus, for his part, was not panicked. He was assessing. Even as the paramedics moved around him and the Chicago streets passed the ambulance windows in the specific blur of emergency transit, he was assessing. The visual disturbance was clearing, slowly, unevenly, like a fog that doesn't lift all at once but retreats in patches. The right hand was recovering motor response. His speech had remained coherent throughout. He was aware, with a clinical precision that his neurologist would later find both impressive and characteristically Marcus Stone, of exactly what his body was doing and what it was not doing. He was also aware, lying on the ambulance gurney with the city sliding past the windows and Kevin sitting 4 feet away trying not to look terrified, of the document, of the 4 pages, of the phrase 3 years should be sufficient, of the calendar in his head that said the timeline they had set was running, and that an actual medical event, a real one, documented, hospital admitted, formally diagnosed, was not a problem in his plan. It was an opportunity. He was aware of this before the ambulance reached Northwestern Memorial. He was aware of it during the CT scan and the MRI, and the 4 hours of neurological assessment conducted by Dr. Raymond Chu, who was 61 years old, Stanford-trained, deeply private, and one of the 3 people on Earth whose professional opinion Marcus Stone trusted without reservation. The other 2 being his late father and a retired appellate judge in Washington, whose name he kept in a locked section of his phone's contact list. He was aware of it when Dr. Chu sat down across from him in the private room they had moved him to, and said, with the specific gravity of a man who has delivered bad news enough times to have found a way to do it without making it worse than it already is, that the scan showed an ischemic event, a mild stroke, caused by a clot that had since resolved, leaving no permanent structural damage that was currently visible but creating a situation that required, in Dr. Chu's professional assessment, significant lifestyle modification, reduced stress, and a monitoring protocol that would involve regular neurological assessment for the foreseeable future. "What's the realistic prognosis?" Marcus asked. "Full cognitive recovery is probable," Dr. Chu said. "Full physical recovery is likely. The risk of recurrence is real but manageable with medication and behavioral change." Marcus, And here he shifted, the clinical frame briefly dropping because he had known this man's father and had treated Marcus since he was 22. You were warned about this 3 years ago. The genetic markers, the stress profile. You were told. I remember, Marcus said. And I had a company to run. Dr. Chu looked at him for a long moment in the way that doctors look at patients who are intelligent enough to understand everything they're being told and stubborn enough to have ignored it anyway. Then he said, "You'll need at least 6 weeks of reduced activity, ideally 3 months. The board will need to be informed." "I'll handle the board," Marcus said. "You'll also need to inform Victoria." A pause, brief. The kind of pause that contains a great deal of information and communicates none of it. "I'll handle Victoria," Marcus said. Dr. Chu left the room. Kevin came in 10 minutes later with a coffee Marcus hadn't asked for, which was Kevin's way of doing something useful when there was nothing useful to be done. Marcus looked at the coffee, then at Kevin, then at the window of the private room, which showed a narrow corridor and the institutional fluorescence of the hospital's neurology wing. "Kevin," he said, "sit down." Kevin sat. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Always," Kevin said, which he meant, which Marcus knew he meant, which made what came next a necessary cruelty. "If you had to choose between this company and me," Marcus said, "what would you choose?" Kevin opened his mouth, closed it. "That's not a fair question." "I know," Marcus said. "Answer it anyway." The silence lasted long enough to be an answer in itself. Kevin said, finally, "I think you know me well enough to know that's not a choice I'd ever want to make." "That's not the same thing," Marcus said. He picked up the coffee, took one sip, set it down. "I want you to go home. I want you to tell no one what we've discussed in this room, and tomorrow morning I want you to behave exactly as you normally would." "Marcus." "I need time," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to give it to me." Kevin left. Marcus sat alone in the private room of Northwestern Memorial with the city invisible beyond the corridor and the monitor tracking his pulse with its slow, steady, metronomic indifference. And he thought about his father, who had collapsed in a room full of people and died with the sentence unfinished, and who had never, not once in his life, had the opportunity to see it coming. Marcus had the opportunity. He was going to use it. He spent 3 days in the hospital. Dr. Chu visited twice daily. Nurses came and went. Victoria arrived on day 1, swept in with the combined force of genuine fear and practiced composure. And Marcus watched her sit at his bedside and hold his hand and look at him with tears in her eyes that he was now unable to interpret with any certainty. Whether they were the tears of a woman who loved him and was terrified, or the tears of a woman who had invested 3 years in a plan and was doing the rapid, cold arithmetic of what this event meant for the timeline. Both, he suspected, which was the worst possibility of all. On the 3rd night, alone at 2 a.m. with the corridor quiet and the monitor keeping its patient time, Marcus got up from the hospital bed, walked to the private bathroom, stood in front of the mirror under the fluorescent light, and began to practice. He made his hand tremble, held it for 10 seconds, released. Again. He let his gaze go vacant, not entirely, not in a way that read as unconscious, but in the particular, disturbing way of someone who is present but unreachable, someone whose lights are on but whose address has changed. He tried 3 versions, discarded 2, settled on the one that felt most specific and therefore most convincing. He said a sentence out loud, then fragmented it further, finding the rhythm of disrupted speech that was distinct from slurring, distinct from aphasia, but that communicated damage in a way that would hold up under casual observation and create enough uncertainty to resist clinical dismissal. He stood in the bathroom of his hospital room for 40 minutes. Then he went back to bed, lay in the dark, and stared at the ceiling. In 6 weeks, he would need everything he had built in 40 minutes to hold under the scrutiny of people who desperately needed it to be real. People who, he was about to discover, wanted him broken badly enough that they would stop looking for evidence that he wasn't. The performance began the next morning when Victoria came in and said, "Good morning, sweetheart," and Marcus turned to look at her with eyes that were present and loving and just slightly, just precisely, just convincingly wrong. She squeezed his hand. "The doctors say you're improving," she said. He looked at her hand on his, then up at her face, then away at the wall at nothing. "Marcus," he said slowly, carefully, with the specific fragmentation he had practiced. "I know you, I know," he stopped, looked at his hand. "I know your face." Her hand tightened on his. And in the mirror of his peripheral vision, Marcus Stone watched his fiancée's eyes and read, in the 3-second window before she rearranged her expression into tender concern, the thing he had hoped he would not see. Relief. Marcus came home from the hospital on a gray November morning in a wheelchair he did not need, pushed by a private nurse he had requested specifically, because she was new to his care, and therefore had no baseline for comparison. The penthouse received him with the particular stillness of a space that has been managed in someone's absence. Everything clean, everything correct, everything positioned with the careful precision of people who were, each in their own way, performing normalcy for an audience they were not sure could still evaluate the performance. The staff was assembled in the main corridor when he arrived. Mrs. Good, straight-backed and gray, with the expression she wore when professional duty required the suppression of personal response. Denise Traylor, standing close enough to Victoria to signal whose side she had already chosen, with a sympathy face so practiced it had become genuine. 2 other household staff whose names Marcus produced on a slight delay, deliberately, visibly, a 2-second gap that was just long enough to register as wrong. And at the end of the line, slightly apart from the others, Clara Wade, standing with the clean, undemonstrative posture of someone who was not performing sympathy and was not performing normalcy, but was simply standing there, present, in the specific way that a person is present when they are not trying to be anything other than what they are. She did not look at him with the particular, devastating cocktail of pity and calculation that he was reading, at varying intensities, on every other face in that corridor. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from his study doorway on her first day, directly, without flinching, with that quality of genuine presence that he had filed away in the part of him that handled important things before they had names. "Mr. Stone," she said when the wheelchair reached her, simply, without performance, as though his title were not a form of condolence. He looked up at her. His eyes were doing the thing he'd practiced, present but unreachable, lights on, address changed. But he looked at her. And in the specific privacy of that look, invisible to everyone else in the corridor because everyone else was watching Victoria arrange his welcome home, with the tender authority of a woman managing a situation, something passed between Marcus Stone and Clara Wade that neither of them could have articulated, and both of them, in different ways, felt. The wheelchair moved on. Clara stepped back into line. The performance had begun. In the first 2 weeks, Marcus constructed his decline with the care of an architect. He held the pen upside down in the study, not always, not predictably, but specifically enough that Kevin, who came in to review correspondence 3 times a week, would notice and document it in the private log Marcus knew Kevin was keeping, because Kevin was the kind of person who managed uncertainty by creating records. He called Kevin by the wrong name. Not randomly, he chose Stephen, a name with the same number of syllables, the same initial consonant cluster in speech, the kind of substitution that was consistent with a specific variety of word retrieval deficit that was well documented in post-stroke literature. He had read 4 medical papers on the subject during his 3 days in the hospital. He had been precise. He stared at the Basquiat in the study, the painting his father had called a map of how power moves, with the expression of a man who does not know what he is looking at. This was, of all the performances, the most personally costly. The painting was not decorative to Marcus. It was communicative. Standing in front of it and manufacturing blankness required a quality of self-discipline that went beyond acting and entered the territory of something more like mourning. He managed it every time. Victoria managed the household with increasing authority. She had moved within 2 weeks from tender concern to gentle management, which was the first transition Marcus had expected, and which told him the timeline from the document was still operative. She canceled 2 medical appointments, rescheduling them to dates 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, citing his fragile state and her desire to give him time to stabilize. Each cancellation was logged in the notes Marcus dictated each night into the small voice recorder he kept in the false bottom of his desk drawer, narrating the events of the day in his real voice, unhurried and precise, into a device that no one in the household knew existed. He had installed the recording devices, 6 of them, in the study, the sitting room, the east corridor, the kitchen, the main conference room of the adjacent corporate suite, and the private elevator lobby on day 4 of being home. He had done this himself, alone, at 3 a.m., with the components that had arrived in a delivery marked as medical monitoring equipment, from a supplier his private security consultant had identified as reliable. The installation had taken 47 minutes. He had been back in bed by 4 a.m., tremoring hand resting on the cover, breathing the slow and regular breath of a man who sleeps deeply and without the capacity for strategy. He was not sleeping. He was listening. The first recording of consequence came on day 9. Victoria in the East Corridor, 10:14 p.m. on her phone, voice low and controlled. "It's moving faster than we thought. The hand thing is real. Kevin's already documenting it. I think we can push the competency review forward by 3 weeks. Dad wants to move before the end of the quarter." A pause. Then, "No, she's not an issue. The new maid, she's nobody." Marcus, in his bed 6 rooms away, heard this on his earpiece. A small, flesh-colored device that he wore in his right ear, and that was tuned to the building's internal monitoring frequency. And he lay in the dark and was very still for a very long time. She's nobody. He thought about Clara Wade, carrying her cleaning caddy, lost on her first day, with the steady dignity of a woman who has never needed anyone's permission to be exactly what she was. He thought about the way she spoke to him, in full sentences, real sentences, without the condescending simplification that everyone else had adopted, as though his intelligence had been the thing the stroke had taken rather than a peripheral blood vessel. He filed the recording, he filed the emotion that accompanied it, and he continued. Kevin Shaw lasted 6 weeks. His departure was not dramatic and not unkind, and because Kevin was a fundamentally decent person doing an indecent thing, it was accompanied by genuine distress. He came into the study on a Tuesday afternoon, sat across from Marcus at the desk where they had, for 4 years, run the operational machinery of an empire together, and watched Marcus try to sign his name on a correspondence form and stop halfway through, staring at the pen with the manufactured bewilderment of a man whose hand has forgotten what it was supposed to do. Kevin's face did something complicated and private and expensive. His resignation letter, delivered to Mrs. Good and filed in the household records, cited personal reasons. Marcus watched him leave from the study window. Kevin walked to the elevator with his personal items in a box that seemed too small for 4 years, pressed the button, waited, stepped in. The doors closed. Marcus picked up the pen, correctly, without hesitation, and signed the correspondence form in one fluid motion. Then he put the pen down and looked at the window and the gray Chicago sky and was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the legal pad. Day 42, he wrote. Kevin Shaw departs. His handwriting was sharp and controlled and completely steady. Recruitment of replacement to be initiated through indirect channels. Continue monitoring. He closed the pad, replaced it, put his hand on the desk and let it begin slowly to tremble. There was a knock at the study door. "Come in," he said, and let the words come out slightly wrong, one beat too slow. The syntax intact but the delivery fragmented enough to read as effort. The door opened. It was Clara with his dinner tray. She set it on the side table. She did not say, "Here you go," with false brightness. She did not arrange the napkin with elaborate care as though he couldn't manage a napkin. She set the tray down, straightened, and looked at him. "The soup is the good kind tonight," she said. "Mrs. Good made the chicken broth. She's better at it than she'd admit." He looked at her, his eyes did the thing, present, unreachable. She did not flinch, did not compensate, simply waited a moment the way you wait for someone who needs a moment and then turned to go. "Clara," he said. The name came out whole, complete, in a rhythm that was just slightly different from the fragmented pattern he'd been using. She turned back. He looked at the soup, then at her. Then he looked away at the window, at the sky. She waited. Then she said, quietly, without drama, "I'll be right outside if you need anything, sir." And she left. And Marcus Stone sat in the dimming afternoon light of his father's study, with the soup getting cold in front of him, and the legal pad in the drawer, and the voice recorder in the false bottom, and 6 recording devices distributed across his home, and the names of his betrayers accumulating in the private ledger of a mind that everyone in his life now believed was broken. And he was not broken. He was the most attentive he had ever been. And he was building the most important document of his professional life. Not in the boardroom, not in a law office, not in the language of financial instruments and legal clauses, but here, in the silence of a performance so complete that the people who wanted to destroy him had already begun to celebrate. The months that followed Marcus's return from the hospital were, for anyone watching from the outside, a story about a woman holding herself together in an impossible situation. Victoria Lane Hartwell was publicly magnificent in her suffering. She gave one interview, carefully placed in a national lifestyle publication with a readership of 4 million, sitting in a simple chair in a room of the penthouse that had been staged to look unstaged, wearing no jewelry except Harold Stone's vintage diamond earrings, her face arranged into the specific expression of a woman who is choosing courage over collapse. She did not discuss medical details. She discussed love. She discussed commitment. She discussed what it meant to stand beside someone when standing beside them required something of you. The journalist, a woman of 40 with 3 journalism awards and a genuine weakness for a well-told love story, described Victoria's composure as extraordinary. The piece ran under the headline, "Love in the Storm, Victoria Hartwell Speaks." The public comments numbered in the thousands. The overwhelming sentiment, admiration, solidarity, the specific, warm outrage of people who felt that a good woman was not receiving sufficient acknowledgement for her sacrifice. Inside the penthouse, the story was different. It was not that Victoria was cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to categorize, easier to present as evidence, easier for the people who witnessed it to process and respond to. Victoria was not cruel. She was surgical. She was the kind of person who understood that the most effective forms of damage are the ones that leave no visible mark, that the most dangerous dismantling happens slowly and is mistaken, at every stage, for something else. She stopped eating dinner with Marcus within the first 3 weeks, citing his restlessness at the table, his unpredictable responses, the way that managing a meal with him had become, as she told Denise with a sigh that was perfectly calibrated between exhaustion and devotion, emotionally exhausting. She said this in the East Corridor, unaware that the corridor was one of 6 locations Marcus had equipped with a recording device. She said it at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Marcus heard it at 11 p.m. on the same Tuesday, alone in the study with his earpiece in and a glass of water on the desk. He logged it, he continued. She moved her wardrobe to the guest suite in week 5, a significant physical relocation that she managed with the logistical efficiency of a woman who had been thinking about it for some time. She told Mrs. Good that Marcus's nighttime agitation made sharing a room untenable for his recovery. She told this to Mrs. Good specifically because Mrs. Good was the member of the household staff whose version of events would be most authoritative in any subsequent documentation. This was a calculation, and it was a correct one, and Marcus heard her make it on the recording from the kitchen at 9:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. She began canceling his medical appointments. The first time, she told Dr. Chu's office that Marcus was having a difficult day and needed to reschedule. The second time, she told them that his baseline had stabilized and they were exploring additional options. The third time, the appointment simply did not appear in the household calendar, and when Kevin, still employed at this point, still trying to maintain the operational rhythm of Marcus's life despite everything, noticed the gap and raised it, Victoria said, with the gentle authority of someone who has taken charge of a situation that required taking charge. "I've spoken with Dr. Chu. We're adjusting the schedule. Kevin, I appreciate your concern, but I think I know what Marcus needs right now." Kevin did not push back. He made a note in his private log and said nothing. Marcus, who heard this exchange from the East Corridor recording at 11 p.m., made his own note. Then he picked up his phone and sent Dr. Chu a text from his personal number, the number he used for private communications that did not pass through the household's shared calendar system, confirming a 6 a.m. appointment at Dr. Chu's home office, 3 days hence. These appointments, disguised as residential physical therapy, visits in the household's external scheduling system, were the mechanism through which Marcus was building the most critical component of his case. 3 independent neurological assessments, conducted by specialists recruited by Dr. Chu and unconnected to any institution with a relationship to the Hartwell network, confirming in documented clinical detail that Marcus Elliot Stone's cognitive function was intact, fully operational, and in no meaningful respect impaired by the ischemic event of 6 weeks prior. The assessments were completed over 2 months. The documentation was 40 pages. It was meticulous. It was, in Dr. Chu's word, bulletproof. It was filed through a law firm in Washington, D.C. with no Chicago connections, with the Cook County Probate Court under seal, to be unsealed at a date and time of Marcus Stone's choosing. Meanwhile, Victoria's phone calls continued. The recordings accumulated. The pattern became unmistakable. Amber Cole was the operational nerve of Victoria's strategy in the household, the woman who translated Victoria's decisions into actions, who coordinated communications with Senator Hartwell's office, who managed the flow of information between the penthouse and the people waiting outside it for the right moment to move. She was efficient and thorough, and crucially, she believed she was safe because she was secondary, because her name was not on any document of consequence and her role was support, not leadership, and she had told herself that this distinction would protect her if the architecture collapsed. She was wrong. Marcus heard everything she said in the corridor, in the kitchen, in the sitting room outside Marcus's study, where she sometimes took calls when she thought the study door was closed. He knew her role as precisely as he knew Victoria's. He knew the name of Senator Hartwell's contact at the probate court. He knew the timeline of the competency motion, which was set to be filed within the next 6 weeks. He knew the name of the second medical professional who had agreed, through an arrangement that Marcus's recordings documented in sufficient detail to constitute evidence of fraud, to provide a certifying opinion of cognitive incapacitation for a fee that had been described, in one phone conversation Amber conducted from the East Corridor, as a consulting arrangement. He knew everything. And then there was Mrs. Patricia Good. Patricia appeared in 11 recordings, 11 separate instances across 6 weeks of a woman who had served the Stone family for 22 years quietly, systematically providing information about the household to Amber Cole, not dramatically, not with the language of conspiracy, in the measured, domestic vocabulary of a woman reporting facts, what Clara had said to Marcus during the dinner service, what she had observed of Marcus's demeanor on certain mornings. Whether Marcus had appeared to recognize the Basquiat, whether his coordination during the morning medication routine had seemed better or worse. She was building a case against Marcus's recovery. She was the most authoritative witness in the house, the longest serving, the most trusted, the one whose observations would carry the most weight in any formal proceeding, and she was feeding that authority into a machine designed to certify that the man she had served for 6 years was broken beyond retrieval. Marcus heard all 11 recordings. He listened to them in sequence on a Sunday night while Chicago was quiet outside his window, and when the last one ended, he sat with the voice recorder in his hand for a long time. He thought about Patricia, about the 22 years, about the way she had stood at his father's funeral and wept, genuinely, he had believed, with the grief of someone who had lost a person they were loyal to in a way that went beyond employment. He thought about why a woman with that depth of loyalty would do this. He didn't have the answer yet, but he was methodical. He had time, and he had learned from his father that the people who surprise you most are not the strangers but the ones who have been standing close enough to be trusted. He would find the reason, and when he did, it would not be the reason he expected. Through all of this, through the recordings and the appointments and the legal filings, and the deliberate, precise construction of the trap he was setting, Marcus Stone sat in his penthouse and watched Clara Wade do her job. She was the only person in the household who did not change. She did not recalibrate her behavior based on what Victoria said, or what Mrs. Good implied, or what the general atmospheric pressure of the household communicated about how a person should respond to the man in the study. She simply did what she had always done, with the same straightforward competence and the same quality of presence that required no audience to sustain itself. She brought his meals, she cleaned his rooms. She read the financial news aloud when she found him in the study, not because she had been asked to, she had never been asked to, but because she had noticed, in the first week of his return, that the Wall Street Journal front page framed on his study wall, the issue from the day he had saved Stone Capital from its first hostile takeover, framed by someone who understood what it meant to him, was positioned directly in his sightline from the chair where he sat in the mornings. And she had understood from that single observation what others in the household had systematically failed to understand, that the man in the chair was still in there, that the person was still present, that he deserved to be addressed as though he were, because until it was definitively proven otherwise, he was. She did not do this from strategy. She did not do it because she suspected the performance. She did it because it was right, in the way that certain people do right things, not as calculation, not as investment, but as the basic, unspectacular expression of who they are. And Marcus Stone, sitting in his chair in the study with his hand performing its careful tremor and his eyes performing their careful vacancy, heard every word she read, filed every moment of it, and felt, for the first time since the night he had read a 4-page document at 1 a.m., and understood that almost everything he had built his private life around was constructed on a foundation someone else had engineered, felt something that was not strategic, not calculated, not filed for future use. He felt seen. It was inconvenient. It was poorly timed. It was, in the architecture of everything he was managing, the one variable he had not planned for. He filed it anyway. There is a category of human experience that does not announce itself as significant. It does not arrive with music or heightened light or the swelling emotional architecture that tells you, the way stories usually tell you, that this is the moment to pay attention. It arrives in the ordinary register of a Tuesday morning or a Thursday evening, wearing the clothing of routine, carrying the syntax of the mundane, and it is only later, sometimes much later, sometimes only in retrospect when everything that follows has made the architecture visible, that you understand what those small, quiet moments were actually building. Between October and January, between Marcus's return from the hospital and the week Victoria's departure became inevitable, there were moments like this. They accumulated without fanfare. They built something that neither Marcus nor Clara named because neither of them, for different reasons, had the vocabulary available for it. Marcus, because he was in the middle of the most complex and high-stakes strategic operation of his professional life. And Clara because she was a woman who had learned, from a childhood of watching her father solve every problem with his hands and never mention the cost, that the correct response to difficult things was to do the next right thing and not stop to narrate it. The first moment, the book. It was 6 a.m. on a Thursday in November, and Clara was cleaning the study, the early slot, before the household fully woke, the hour she preferred because the penthouse in those minutes had a quality of stillness that the rest of the day never quite recovered. She was dusting the shelves beside the desk when she noticed the book left open, face down, on the corner of the mahogany surface. Behavioral Economics and the Architecture of Choice by Richard Thaler. A serious book. A book that required a specific kind of attention. A book that had no business being left casually on a desk in a household where everyone had agreed, at least implicitly, that the man who lived here was no longer capable of the kind of reading it required. She looked at the open page, chapter title, The Cost of Choosing Loyalty Over Logic. She was still looking at it when Marcus walked in from the hallway, dressed for what the household had been told was a light morning walk. A concession to recovery that the medical team had recommended, and that was, in fact, a 6-minute circuit of the penthouse's interior that Marcus used as cover for checking each recording device on the route. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. She looked up from the book. "You know that book," he said. The question came out in his performance voice, slightly fragmented, the syntax a beat behind the thought. But his eyes were on her, and his eyes were doing something that the performance voice was not doing. His eyes were simply watching. She did not make a point of noticing the discrepancy. "My father used to say that every bad decision he ever made had a rational explanation," she said. "I think this book is about why he was right." Marcus looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to be something. Then he said, and this time, just for that sentence, just in the privacy of the moment between them before the performance reasserted itself, "What kind of man was your father?" She looked back at him. Something passed through her face, something careful and old. "The kind who built things with his hands and didn't count the cost," she said. "The good kind." He held her gaze for one more second. Then the vacancy returned to his eyes, chosen, practiced, necessary, and he moved past her to the window, and the morning resumed. She put the book down, picked up her dust cloth, but she noticed, later in the day, when she returned to the study to close the windows against the afternoon wind, that the book was gone from the desk, and in the place where it had been, there was a single line written on a notepad in the sharp, angular handwriting of a man who had full command of his hand. "The good kind are always the ones who pay the most." She read it twice. Then she tore the page carefully from the pad and put it in the pocket of her uniform. She told no one. It sat in her pocket all day like something warm. The second moment, the phone call. Tommy Wade called his sister at 7:43 p.m. on a Wednesday in December, 3 minutes after Clara had finished serving Marcus his dinner in the study, and was standing in the corridor outside the door with an empty tray, and the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been doing everything right for a very long time in a house where everything right goes unacknowledged. She answered. She could tell from Tommy's voice within the first 5 seconds before he'd finished the first sentence that something was wrong. The scholarship hold, a bureaucratic error in the financial aid office that had generated an outstanding balance flag against Tommy's account, freezing his registration for the upcoming semester. The community college's financial aid office had a 4-week resolution timeline. The semester started in 3 weeks. If the hold wasn't cleared, Tommy would lose his enrollment slot, and if he lost the slot, The scholarship committee's reinstatement policy required a full reapplication cycle, which meant a full year out, which meant the momentum of the first year gone, which meant Clara's mind moved through it all in the time it took Tommy to explain it. The chain of consequences unfolding with the specific, grinding logic of poverty, which is not dramatic the way stories make it but procedural, bureaucratic. A series of connected doors that close one after another in a system that was not designed with your particular situation in mind. She kept her voice even. She told Tommy she would handle it. She told him not to worry. She said it with the specific calm of a woman who does not yet know how she will handle it and is not going to communicate that uncertainty to her 19-year-old brother because his confidence in the solubility of problems is one of the things she has decided to protect. She hung up, stood in the corridor for a moment with the tray in her hands, breathed. Then she went back into the study to retrieve the water glass she had forgotten. Marcus's dinner plate was untouched. He was looking at her, not with the performance expression, not with the vacant, unreachable eyes of the last several weeks, looking at her the way he had looked at her over the taller book, directly, present, fully operational. She registered this and did not react to it, because she had been registering it in small and undeniable increments for weeks. The moments when the performance slipped by a fraction. The moments when the man behind the architecture became briefly, unmistakably visible. She had been filing these moments in the same part of herself that she filed things she didn't yet have the full information to understand. "You forgot the glass," he said, fully, without fragmentation. "I did," she said. She picked it up. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm fine, sir." He looked at the plate. Then he pushed it toward her slowly, deliberately, the gesture unmistakable. "Have you eaten?" She had not eaten. She had been on her feet since 6 a.m. and had not eaten, because the household's dinner service ran until 8:30 and she ate after, and the call from Tommy had taken the appetite and replaced it with the grinding, procedural anxiety of a problem she didn't yet know how to solve. She shook her head. He pushed the plate further. She looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down across from him at the desk, in the chair where Kevin used to sit, in the chair where powerful people had sat for years conducting the business of an empire, and she ate. And Marcus Stone sat across from her, and did not eat and did not perform and did not say anything, and neither did she. And the silence between them was not awkward or loaded, but simply companionable. The way silence is between people who do not need to narrate their presence to justify it. When she finished, she stood, cleared the plate and said, "Thank you." He said nothing, but when she reached the door he said quietly, in the register of his real voice, "The scholarship, how much is the hold?" She turned, her face was very still. "It's not your concern, sir." "How much?" he said, not a question this time. She told him. A number, a specific, finite, manageable number that was, in the architecture of Marcus Stone's resources, so small as to be essentially imperceptible, and that was, in the architecture of Clara Wade's current financial situation, the difference between her brother's future and a year of lost momentum. Marcus looked at the number as though calculating something. Then he looked at her. "Go to bed, Clara," he said. "It'll be handled." She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Stone." "Go to bed." She went. The third moment, the dark. She found him in the study one evening in late December with the lights off. Not unusual, he had been found in the dark before, part of the performance, a behavioral symptom consistent with the narrative. But this evening, something was different. The quality of his stillness was different. The way he was sitting, not staged vacancy but genuine weight. The weight of a man who is carrying something enormous and has set it down for a moment not because he is done carrying it, but because his arms need 1 minute of rest. She did not turn on the light. She had brought a glass of water which she set on the side table beside him. Then she sat down in the chair across the desk. She did not speak for a long time. He did not perform for her. He simply sat in the dark with the weight of everything he was managing, and she sat across from him, and the city glittered 40 floors below them through the windows, indifferent and brilliant. "My dad used to go quiet like this after hard days," she said eventually. Her voice was not soft in the way of someone managing another person's emotion. It was just her voice, her actual voice, in a room where there was no one performing and no one managing and no one calculating the effect of their words. "We just sit." He said sitting in silence with someone who wasn't afraid of your silence was the most underrated kindness in the world. Marcus did not respond. He was still. His hand on the desk was absolutely steady, not because he had forgotten to perform, but because, in this moment with this person, the performance felt like the dishonesty it was. He was still for a long time. Then very quietly, so quietly it was almost not sound at all. "He sounds like someone worth knowing." Clara looked at him across the desk in the dark. In the city light from the windows, his face was the face of a man and not a performance. She held this. She did not react. She simply held it and let it be what it was and said nothing. She left half an hour later. In the morning, when she came to clean the study, the glass of water was empty, and on the notepad beside it, in Marcus's handwriting, "Thank you." She put the note in her pocket. She already had one. She was beginning to have a collection. By the time January arrived, the architecture of the betrayal had fully revealed itself to Marcus through his recordings, and the architecture of the household had shifted in ways that anyone paying close attention could have read like weather. But most people in the household were not paying close attention to the right things. They were watching Victoria and reading her movements as the story she wanted them to read, which was the story of a devoted woman reaching her limit. The board of Stone Capital moved in week 7. It was led by Richard Blaine, 55 years old, chief operating officer, a man who had been with the company for 11 years, whom Marcus had promoted 3 times and trusted with the operational nerve of the company during the months when Marcus himself was too deep in strategy to manage execution. Richard was a particular kind of man, the kind whose loyalty was not false but was, like most things, conditional on cost. When the cost of loyalty was low, he was among the most loyal people Marcus knew. When the cost rose above a certain threshold, when maintaining loyalty required something beyond professional devotion, when it required personal risk, when it required choosing a man over a machine, Richard Blaine discovered that he had limits he had not previously needed to acknowledge. He came to the penthouse on a Thursday morning with 2 other board members, and a lawyer Marcus recognized from the firm the board used for internal governance matters. They sat in the sitting room. Victoria was present, positioned, Marcus noted from his chair, at a precise angle that was deniably peripheral while remaining engaged, the body language of someone who is managing a situation while appearing to support a person. Marcus sat in the wheelchair he no longer needed and held the pen upside down, and looked at the document they placed in front of him with the carefully constructed blankness of a man who is trying very hard to understand something that has become too large for his comprehension. "Marcus, buddy," Richard said, and his voice contained genuine distress. This was, in the recordings Marcus had of him, the most honest Richard had been in months, the most visible the gap between what Richard was doing and what Richard wished he did not have to do. "This is for the company, for your father's legacy. The co-management clause, it's temporary, it's protective, it's what Harold would have wanted." Marcus looked at the document. His left hand tremored gently. His right hand remained still, which was a specific and deliberate inversion of his practiced pattern, varied enough to maintain authenticity, consistent enough to maintain the narrative. He looked up at Richard. His eyes were doing the thing. "Harold," he said slowly, as though testing the name's weight, "my father." "Yes," Richard said gently, "your father." Marcus looked back at the document. He made the specific expression of a man trying to read something that will not resolve into legible meaning. Then he put the pen down, looked at his hands. In the recording Marcus captured from the sitting room device that evening, played back through his earpiece in the study at 11 p.m., Richard Blaine is on the phone 20 minutes after leaving the penthouse. He is not distressed. His voice has shed the gentleness of the meeting and returned to its operational register. He says, "It's done. He couldn't follow the document. Chu's assessment gives us the clinical foundation and the Hartwell motion can move now. End of quarter is realistic. Tell Gerald we're on schedule." Marcus listened to this. He logged it. He added Richard Blaine's name to the document he was building in the Washington, D.C. law firm. Then he took out the legal pad and made a note that he did not dictate into the recorder, wrote it by hand, in the private shorthand he had developed over decades of working at the intersection of intelligence and power. RB end of quarter. Financial review. Authorize independent audit of all interim transactions from date of co-management appointment. Scope. Complete. He underlined complete 3 times. Then he closed the pad. Richard Blaine had been operational head of Stone Capital for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, Marcus's independent financial auditors, retained through the same Washington, D.C. firm, completely insulated from the Chicago network, had documented 47 financial transactions authorized under the co-management clause that fell outside the parameters of the clause's actual authority. The aggregate value of these unauthorized transactions was significant. Significant enough that Richard Blaine's decision to choose the Hartwell machine over Marcus Stone was not merely a moral failure, but, when the documentation was complete and the audit was finalized, a federal one. Marcus had known about the transactions for 3 weeks. He had not moved on them. He was waiting. The most dangerous mistake a predator makes is believing the prey doesn't know it's being hunted. He was still hunting. Victoria's departure, when it came, was managed with the same precision she applied to everything. She did not leave angry. Anger was for people who had lost control. Victoria left in a narrative she had authored 2 weeks in advance, through Amber Cole's cultivation of 3 media contacts who owed Victoria favors, and who could be counted on to receive the story she gave them and present it in the frame she required. The press release went out on a Tuesday morning. Victoria Hartwell steps back. "I cannot watch the man I love disappear and call it living." 3 outlets ran it simultaneously, a coordination that would have been visible to anyone looking for it and that Marcus had documented through his recordings. The photographs were arranged. Victoria outside the charity she had affiliated herself with over the past month, a white dress, no makeup. The specific aesthetic of artless grief. Her publicist had approved 4 takes of the image before selecting the final one. This was in a recording from Amber Cole's phone in the East Corridor, 9:22 p.m., the evening before the release. In the same week, Senator Gerald Hartwell filed a motion in Cook County Probate Court to accelerate the competency review of Marcus Elliott Stone, citing the ethical obligation to protect an incapacitated individual's assets from continued mismanagement. Richard Blaine issued a supporting board statement within 24 hours. The machine was running. The timeline was closing. By the senator's calculation, Marcus had 6 weeks before a formal competency ruling that would trigger the succession clause, transfer operational control, and make everything Harold Stone had built for 30 years the property of a plan that had been running for 3. Victoria came to the penthouse the evening after her press release, ostensibly to collect remaining personal items. She moved through the rooms with the efficient composure of a woman closing a chapter she had written. She spent 20 minutes in the study with Marcus, who sat in his chair and looked at the wall and said 3 words in the 15 minutes she spoke, and then called for Clara. Clara came to the sitting room and stood in the doorway. Victoria was seated. She gestured to the chair across from her with the warm, particular smile of a woman who has decided to deliver damage in the register of kindness, because kindness is harder to document and harder to defend against. "Clara," she said, "sit down, I want to talk to you." Clara sat. What followed was 8 minutes of precision work. Victoria expressed concern about Clara's attachment to Marcus. She used phrases like professional boundaries and his best interests and people will talk in the specific sequence of someone who has thought about the order of words carefully. She mentioned Mrs. Good, and the mention was a threat dressed as an observation. She offered a reference for another position with the warmth of a woman doing someone a kindness, and the intent of a woman eliminating a complication. And she said at the end, very quietly, with the smile of someone who has just placed the last piece of a puzzle, a fresh start might be good for everyone. She meant leave, or I will make leaving happen to you. Clara was silent for a moment. Her face was completely still. Her hands in her lap were completely still. Then she said, "Thank you, Miss Hartwell, I'll think about it." She stood, walked out of the sitting room, went to the staff bathroom on the service floor, sat on the edge of the tub, and cried for 6 minutes. Not performance, not managed distress. Genuine, private, exhausted crying. The kind that accumulates over months of carrying too much with too little acknowledgement in a house where the most powerful person in the room has just told her, in the language of kindness, that she is disposable. 6 minutes, then she washed her face. Cold water thorough, the way her father had taught her. Don't let them see the water, Clara. Save it for when you're alone, then wash it off and walk back out. She walked back out. She served breakfast the next morning at 7 a.m., as though nothing had happened. And in the sitting room recording captured at 10:17 p.m. the same evening Victoria's departure conversation with Clara took place, Marcus heard the whole thing. All 8 minutes. Victoria's precision, Clara's stillness, the offer of the reference as a threat. He sat with it for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out the legal pad, and wrote 3 words in the calm, controlled handwriting of a man who has reached the end of his patience with a specific category of behavior. He underlined the 3 words. He did not write them here in this document because they were private. They were the first personal thing Marcus Stone had written in 4 months that was not strategy and not evidence and not documentation. They were the beginning of something else. Something no one in his life had seen coming. Clara Wade had a system for surviving difficult things, and the system had been installed in her by a man who had spent his life building things and never once built anything with more care than the architecture of his daughter's character. The system was simple. It had 3 components. The first, do the next right thing, not the next comfortable thing, not the next safe thing. The next right thing, which was frequently neither comfortable nor safe and which had the considerable advantage of being identifiable even in conditions of very low visibility, which is to say, even when everything around you was dark and uncertain and the road ahead could not be seen, the next right thing was usually close enough to touch. The second, don't let them see the water. Grief was legitimate. Exhaustion was legitimate. Fear was legitimate. All of these were real and deserved space and should not be suppressed in ways that would eventually make them structural problems. But there was a time and a place, and the time was when you were alone, and the place was private. And once you had given the feeling the 6 minutes or the 20 minutes or the hour it needed, you washed your face and you walked back out. The third, which James Wade had given her not as a verbal instruction but as a lifelong demonstration, stay. When things get difficult, when the situation becomes unclear, when the people around you begin to leave because the cost of staying has exceeded what they are willing to pay, stay. Not out of stubbornness, not because leaving would be wrong, but because there is a specific, irreplaceable kind of integrity available only to the person who remains when remaining requires something real, and once you have walked away from that integrity, you cannot buy it back. She had applied all 3 components to the Stone household with the same methodical consistency her father had applied to the construction sites he managed. Not heroically, not in ways that anyone would notice or document, but steadily, one day after another, in the ordinary and unspectacular performance of a person doing what they believed was right. The household had changed around her. People had left, or shifted, or recalibrated their allegiances in response to the gravitational pull of Victoria's narrative. Denise Traylor, who had started out as harmlessly gossipy, had crossed by December into something more active. She relayed information about Clara's interactions with Marcus to Amber Cole, framed in the language of concern. She spends a lot of time in his study, more than the cleaning requires. I'm not saying it's anything, I think Mrs. Good should know. Mrs. Good knew. Mrs. Good had been knowing things and reporting them for weeks. What no one in the household knew was that Marcus also knew, because all of it was on the recordings and he had been listening. Clara did not know she was being watched and reported on. She would not have changed her behavior if she had known, because her behavior was not a performance that required an uninformed audience to function. She continued to bring Marcus his meals, continued to speak to him in full sentences, continued to read the financial news when she found him in the study. Not every time, not in a way that had become routine or formulaic, but when it seemed right, when the morning had the quality of a morning when words would help. She noticed things that the rest of the staff did not notice, or noticed and processed differently. She noticed that Marcus's hand trembled when other people were watching and stilled when they were not. Not always, not dramatically, but with a consistency that a person who was paying a certain kind of attention would eventually identify as a pattern rather than a variation. She noticed that he called Kevin, Stephen, in Kevin's presence and Marcus in her presence, during the one time she had overheard him on his earpiece, thinking she had left the corridor. She noticed that the book on his desk changed, that new books appeared and disappeared, serious books, current books, books that required a fully operational mind to engage with, books that had no business being on the desk of a man whose reading comprehension had been assessed by the household as severely compromised. She did not know what to make of these observations. She did not have the information that would have allowed her to make something specific of them. She simply noted them, the way her father had taught her to read a construction site, not looking for one thing, not expecting one pattern, but staying generally attentive, storing data, trusting that the picture would become clear when enough pieces were in place. She filed them in the same internal storage as the note in his handwriting that said, "The good kind are always the ones who pay the most," and the note that said, "Thank you," and the evening in the dark when his voice had come through the performance for a single sentence and said something about her father that meant he had been listening, really listening, in a way that the person he was performing to be was not capable of. She did not discuss any of this with anyone. Denise Traylor tried twice. The first time over morning coffee in the staff kitchen. "Does he ever say anything to you when you're in the study? Like anything that makes sense," Clara said. "He's doing his best," and changed the subject. The second time in the corridor outside the study door. "Victoria thinks you're getting too attached. I'm only telling you because I'd want to know." Clara looked at Denise for a moment with a gaze that was not hostile and not warm, and that communicated, with perfect economy, that the information had been received and assessed, and was not going to produce the response Denise had been sent to collect. "Thank you, Denise," she said, and walked into the study with Marcus's afternoon water. The days after Victoria's departure had a particular quality in the household, the quality of aftermath, of the specific silence that follows a loud event when the reverberations have faded, and what is left is just the reality of what has changed. Victoria's wardrobe was gone from the guest suite. Her toiletries were gone from the bathroom she had occupied. The spaces she had occupied in the household had closed around her absence with the particular efficiency of spaces that were never really hers. Marcus,